All right, thank you, Lauren, for inviting me and giving me this chance to make this presentation. And thank you, everyone, for once again being part of this wonderful community that comes together every Sabbath. The topic is, in some ways, difficult to present because everyone knows something about leadership, and everyone has experienced leadership as a leader or as a recipient of leadership, good and bad. But it's also in some ways easy because everybody knows something about leadership. And I hope that you will engage in the conversations later on about your own experience of leadership. All right, so here goes. Want to leave some questions for you to be thinking about that we will discuss later on. What kind of leadership works best for you? How do you personally like to be led? That would be quite interesting to hear from you, what you believe works best for you and what you respond to best. And then think of a situation when a church leader made something successful happen, something that left you pleased or made you admire their style. And also the opposite, when a leader killed a successful initiative. We want to hear some stories, some case studies, if you would be willing to share. And of course, we are living in a time when everything is changing. What does that mean for leadership? Can you anticipate some of the ways that leaders from the congregation up are going to have to change? What's leadership for our time rather than for the past and what worked in the past? So some questions for you to think about and hopefully discuss when we come to the end. As you may know, there are many models of leadership, many theories of leadership. And I do not intend to go anywhere close to any of these models or theories. Some of you are well versed in these and probably can explain these far better than I can. My focus is somewhat different for this presentation. In 2012, I wrote a short monograph that Paul Richardson, I don't know whether Paul is in this forum today, but he is now the CEO of Adventist today, that he published through the Center for Creative Ministries, Adventist. And in the opening page, here's what I wrote. This was 2012. The flourishing of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Western societies is largely dependent on the flourishing of individual congregations. Our usual approaches to leadership do not empower and release congregations or their leaders to achieve their God-inspired potential. Doggedly adhering to these approaches could eventually prove to be terminal, if not for the denomination, at least for the human spirit within those serving in it. So this pretty much was the thesis that I operated under 9 years ago, or even before that I put into words. And I thought I would briefly highlight a couple of things from that monograph as we proceed here this afternoon. So I made 4 propositions, and you can judge whether these are still valid or whether they were even valid then. The local congregation is the most effective community to bring people to faith, nurture people in their faith, and to equip them for lives of discipleship. At the time, it seemed to me, it still does, that this is sort of a no-brainer, that the local congregation is where the action is, and that's where people are incorporated into the faith. It's through connections with the local congregation that people come to faith. and are nurtured and are equipped, given opportunity to serve, and so on. And therefore, number two, the primary function of a denominational entity such as a conference should be to foster the flourishing of faith communities, local congregations. Now, at the time I wrote this, I could not have, and nobody could have envisioned communities such as this one that's meeting this afternoon, connected across the ocean, across the miles, and yet sensing a degree of community, and can very well be called a congregation, I think. But the primary function of a denominational entity should be to foster the flourishing of faith communities, no matter what shape they take in today's environment. Number three, now some of you will remember that there were 2 or 3 C words that scared the daylights out of some church people. One was celebration. You remember all the fuss about guitars and drums being brought into the church, celebration churches. And then another C word was congregationalism. The idea that congregationalism or the empowerment of congregations will lead to the demise of the denomination and the hierarchy. That fear was pretty intense, it still might be. But what I observed was that congregationalism will continue to change the face of the Adventist denomination in the West, if not in form and function, very decidedly in attitudes and self-understandings. And I stand by this assertion that our thinking, at least here in the West, in many places, is congregational. We think of the value of the local congregation and our connections with it and the value it brings to us. And number 4, again, something everybody now recognizes: the world is flattened, connected, in a rapid state of flux. Communication and information no longer travel up and down, which has implications for leadership, of course, but out to all at once. Leadership in this flattened world has no precedents. Models that worked in the past are failing us now. And this may be what warrants the kind of conversation that we are having today. What kind of leadership works best for us in the context that we find ourselves? Now, if you would pardon me, I also want to refer to the writings of somebody else. Lauren Mead was the founder of what was called the Alban Institute at Duke Divinity School in North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And he kind of pioneered the whole area of congregational studies. And he wrote more about it at that time than anybody else. But in 1994, he came up with a series of books called The Once and Future Church. And one of those was this book called, entitled Transforming Congregations for the Future. Now, he identified 9 issues. I want to mention those and have you think about which of them, if any, are still valid. So this is what he said. And by the way, the middle judicatory, he I believe was Episcopalian, hierarchical community. And in our context, the middle judicatory would be a conference, I believe, a conference. So when you see the term middle judicatory, think about a conference. So here's what he claimed: congregations need help when they get into trouble. Middle judicatories need to develop a capacity to help congregations clarify what's at the bottom of the trouble and work out a strategy for dealing with it. The middle judicatory does not need to be able to solve the problems. Congregations need help when they get into trouble. And then very interestingly, he He wrote, congregations need to be left alone. For the most part, when congregations are not actively asking for help, middle judicatories need to leave them alone. Most congregations have programs in place and energy harnessed to their tasks. Most congregations have a pretty good working relationship with their pastors. You go through this, you might think about, is any of this true in your setting, in your context, in your circles? Congregations need to be guided when they are off base. Congregations need somebody to hold them accountable, which he wrote is different from calling the shots. The middle judicatory, the conference, needs to get involved, ask questions, and if necessary, put congregations on the defensive and make them think about what they're doing. Congregations need pastoral care. Congregations need grief care when facing the loss of a pastor or key lay leader, when the building burns down or is flooded, as well as needing someone to be there in the moments of celebration and the marking of milestones. Congregations need pastoral care for their pastors. The pastoral care needed from middle judicatories is the kind that make people the first-class professional leaders they intend to be. Middle judicatories need to be aware of the heavy stresses and try to make resources available for the clergy person, temporarily overwhelmed, seriously depressed, or ill. But they need to exercise a bias toward health, giving clergy additional challenges and resources, not sympathy. 6, congregations need help with leadership development. He claimed the most serious gap is the inadequate training support middle judicatories give when clergy and lay leaders are starting up a new leadership team. A lesser opportunity is available every year when new board members are selected for the congregation. Every such change is an opportunity for new term team building for congregational leadership. And then coming toward the end, 7, 8, and 9, congregations need technical assistance. In his day, that meant basic planning skills and knowledge about how institutions work. These are important for congregations in changing times. Congregations often also need help from outside to understand what is going on in the world in which they minister. Is that still true? And when he says outside, does that today mean the conference or other resources? Congregations need a sense of their place in a larger mission. And I might mention that in my thinking, this probably is the most important and maybe even the only significant role that the General Conference in our setting can play to give a sense of our place in a larger global mission. Too many congregations get locked into the local sense of mission with such enthusiasm that they turn their backs on needs beyond their boundaries. The middle judicatory has a special responsibility to help the congregation widen the horizon for mission. And then finally, he says congregations need someone who listens and listens and listens. The most important thing a congregation may need is somebody outside who just listens and pays attention. And he's talking, of course, with somebody who has a role in the judicatory. So these are 9 observations he makes of what he believed congregations need from, we might say, the denomination, the denominational entity. Do any of these still apply? And in what sense? That's something to think about. So my thinking is that the primary renewal of the church has to happen in the local congregation. It is only at this point in the church system that communities of people can actually encourage, teach, mentor, and interact on a personal level with any rate of real permeation. Now, conferences can do some of this with a few people, but only in the congregation is it actually possible to engage every or most participants in some meaningful way. Another observation about leadership and the kind of leadership needed: the culture of a church and habits of people often perpetuate congregational dysfunctions. These are sometimes hard to identify and recognize by those within the congregational system. Fresh pairs of eyes from outside the congregation can be helpful. And having served in a denominational office, in a conference office for a number of years, I can say that this is probably one of those significant areas of contribution that I think we can make, that we do make, is bring a fresh pairs of eyes to a situation where people on the inside may not always see what the dysfunctions are or the cause for the dysfunctions. And I was helped years ago taking a class under Rabbi Edwin Friedman, who wrote quite a bit about family systems in church and synagogue. And he helped he explained how family systems theories work in congregations and how the identified patient may not be the real patient, and try to diagnose what's going on in a family system as it works out, plays out in a church. Congregations have a DNA embedded in them. And often that DNA is embedded by the founding pioneers of the congregation or some dominant people who have been there. And it's amazing how those patterns of dealing with conflict, let's say, patterns of leadership, how those are perpetuated in a congregation. And years later, people may not even recognize why they do things the way they do. But if you listen to the emerging story of the congregation, you might discover how it is that that particular DNA was embedded into that congregation. We have churches here in Ohio, at least a couple that I can think of, whose basic identity is that they are not the other church in town. The other church in town may be the dominant church, maybe the larger church, institutional church, and people left there and formed their own church decades ago. But 30, 40 years later, their identity still is, we are not them, we are not that church. And that doesn't show a whole lot until you listen to their stories. I'm familiar with churches that got started, were planted, not to enhance the mission of the church, but because some key families couldn't get along in what we might call the mother church. So they leave and they establish a new church, but what they take with them is this sense of conflict they had with somebody or a group of people, and that seems to shape the DNA of that congregation. And it's amazing, it's fascinating to watch and observe and identify that years later. Another feature of leadership: different cultures use different criteria to determine what good leadership is. What is seen as strength in one culture may be a considerable impediment in another culture. For instance, in some cultures, one might need to take strong, decisive action in order to be seen as a leader. While in other cultures, consultation and a democratic approach, a collaborative approach, may be the preferred approach to exercising effective leadership. Why does this matter? When you have a general conference session and we are talking about leadership, it becomes evident that in certain parts of the world see certain qualities in a leader that other parts of the world do not see as being essential. So that is seen in these global meetings. it also has implications, I believe now, in the pastoral staffing of our churches, here in the North American division at least, where the staffing has become more multinational. Now, this is not a good or bad comparison, or right or wrong. It is just to highlight the difference that pastors from certain parts of the world might bring a certain approach to leadership that they have been culturated in, that says this is what a good leader is. But in a church here, that may not translate into what good leadership is. So it has some implications. And so as the church changes, our expectations of leaders also change. And this exercise is kind of to think about what that might look like. As the church changes, what we need leaders for also changes. I want to give you some case studies, short ones, just to highlight some of what I have said here. Many of you on this forum will recognize what these are. You may not have seen one of these. I have not. But in the 1950s, 60s, these were computers. Now, and the people who operated them were the experts. If you needed something done by one of these humongous machines, you needed the expert. The expert knew what buttons to push, what wires to move, and how to make this work. Then came the desktop and the laptop and the tablet and the smartphone, etc., that basically made the expert, in this context at least, irrelevant. Professor Clayton Christensen, who taught at Harvard Business School, wrote quite a bit about innovation. He was kind of the specialist in talking about innovation in management and business. But he coined the term, I believe, he's the one who coined the term disruptive innovation. And he made the point that when the desktop and the laptop were invented, they disrupted this whole system of having experts manage, operate these large computers. Disruptive innovation. I believe that lots of disruptive innovation has occurred in the church, because of which the hierarchy anymore doesn't have the utility that it once did. Times have changed. It's not about the people necessarily, but times have changed, and so our needs have changed. Let me give you some case studies. Some of you who have been pastors, who are pastors, might remember the January workers' meetings. I couldn't understand why they called it workers' meetings, because it suggests that if you're not in that group, you're not a worker. I prefer to call it pastors' meetings, but every January we would have a meeting of all the pastors in the conference, and somebody from either the union or the division would show up with a massive notebook, and they would unfold for us the plan for the year, the goals, the plan, the methods, how to do it, because they were the experts. They had the information, they had the know-how, and they would come, and our role as pastors would be to follow directions, follow instructions. And if we did, supposedly we would reach our goals. So the only skill that was needed in that setting was to be able to follow instructions. You didn't need to be creative. You need not take responsibility to try to create systems, programs that worked. Just follow the directions. And if they failed, it was not our fault. You told us to do what we did. That has changed. We don't need the expert anymore to bring the notebooks and show up to tell us what to do. The sources of information are so many, and they are at our fingertips. So that has changed in terms of leadership expectation. Another story, 3 small rural churches, after trying everything they could to grow, to sustain themselves, after much dialogue, come to the conclusion that they would be better off if they merged and established themselves as a new church in a central location. They talked about it, they prayed about it, they imagined what that might look like. And after quite a while of working out all the details, each of the churches at a business session voted that they would merge, become one church. And then they communicated to the conference office, conference administrators, their desire to merge. And the conference president said no. Said, we are not in the business of closing churches. We are in the business of building churches. And in fact, if we did this, on the statistical report at the end of the year, it would show less congregations in our territory than more. And so while the local people were pretty clear that this was the best thing for them and their long-term sustainability, the leadership somehow didn't see that. And I highlight that as a failure of leadership, to recognize what the local people felt was a good thing and to support it and to nurture it. Now, those churches struggled on for a couple more decades. And then under a new administration, 2 of them merged, 1 of them didn't. And that one church has, I'm told today, 7 or 8 people worshiping on a Sabbath morning. I wrote in the article about the school merger. I'm familiar with this, where 2 churches, not too many miles apart, decided to merge their 2 schools. Each of them had a junior academy. And so they worked out the details, they merged, they leased a new building. They didn't want to convey the sense that one of them closed and joined another one. They both shut down and joined, and it seemed like they did it with a lot of energy, a lot of vision and expectations for the future. From what I understand, the students loved it, a larger school, the faculty, staff loved it, parents liked what was going on. And so they got off to a good start with a lot of promise for the future. But then things began to unravel. The 2 churches, I might say, have very different cultures, very different leadership styles. And so it wasn't too long before some of the folk on the school board from each of those churches began to see things differently. Their leadership styles were different, their expectations, whatever, they just couldn't get along and support something that seemed to be going well. And so they sacrificed the mission, the school, in order to protect their own views, their own biases. And the school was shut down, and each church then went back to operating its own school. So which raises the question, of leadership. should we not expect leaders, even if they have differences among themselves, to put the mission of the school, in this case, ahead of personal preferences? Shouldn't that be a characteristic of leaders of a local church, of a local school, or of the hierarchy, of supporting what seems to be working and encouraging those who are involved in that? I already mentioned something about the church's DNA, but I want to tell you a story about an experience from the other side. As a conference leader, I used to get calls from church leaders asking for help. And it feeds your ego when you get a call like that, that somebody values your opinion and your advice. But here was a church, they were having some problems, and they wanted us to come and help them sort it out. And we did. We went over there, and they explained, the leaders explained what the issues were. And by that time, I had experienced a process that I learned some years before that from a church consultant. And we decided to implement that process, which we had done many times before. And that was very simple, but very time consuming. And that is not to assume that what a group of leaders tell you is exactly the way it is. And therefore, the process we followed was to listen to everybody in the church one by one. This was not a huge church, and there were times when we would spend, 2 or 3 of us would spend 2 or 3 days in 30-minute interviews, one-on-one, 3 of us in 3 different rooms, listening to people, taking notes. And after we had listened to everybody who wanted to talk, we would call for a meeting, church meeting, the end of 3 days, and tell them, here's what we heard from all of you. And you can understand the value of this. There are individuals who will not speak up in a group. And if you had a group meeting and try to get at the issues, often few people would dominate and the rest will not say much. And so this was a way of hearing everybody in the church who wanted to talk, 30, 40, 50 people or more. So in this particular case, we heard the people, we gave the report at the end of this process. And the lady who was the initiator of this process by calling us in, she was livid. She was very upset that the story that the people had told us was different from the way she had represented the church's problems to us. And the reason I remember this particular instant is that in her speech at that church meeting, she said this idea was conceived in hell. The idea of listening to all the people in the church tell us what is going well and what wasn't, that was an idea conceived in hell. And I bring this up because despite all of that, not much changed. Churches do not change just because somebody from the outside comes and says, here's a problem, here's the way to change it, unless there is a collective will to make a change. And so sometimes leaders misrepresent things. Sometimes leaders from the outside might have great ideas, but unless the local people buy into it, the local leaders buy into it, does not work. I wrote about the next one, a church for all. A pastoral couple out of seminary, moved into the downtown area of a metropolitan city, began a ministry aimed at reaching people who typically are not in a church. And they established a ministry. They got a building there, and I've been to their church a few times. They begin by serving breakfast. People come by bus. There's a bus halt right outside their little building, and people would come and eat and fellowship and enjoy Sabbath school worship, eat again, and the people that they attracted to their congregation were not the typical people that you would see in most churches. And things were going well. They were growing until administration changed, and the pastor was told, we are going in a different direction, and pretty much undermined the value of the ministry, which was distinctive, I think, which was sort of unique. And in time, that ministry pretty much ended. I wrote about conference lines. Now, it is quite intriguing that today, with all the technology we have for communication, for travel, all of that, that we have overlapping conference lines. And I'm not talking about the issue of regional conferences, Black conferences, and that issue. I'm talking about the overlap. In our union, there are three conferences that share same geographical territory or parts of it. And when you think about the duplication of services and the resources involved in that, you wonder why in the world we would perpetuate a system that at one time might have made sense. I don't know. I know the conference lines were drawn to limit the distance people had to travel. Conference leaders had to travel when travel was not as convenient. But the situation now in these conferences that are overlapping is that you have churches within just a few miles of other churches. If you are not a member of a certain church and send your child to a school operated by another church, you pay a higher tuition rate, all kinds of issues. And here is an example, I think, of where leadership authority has not been used wisely and appropriately to try to dismantle some of these redundancies. And there might be other examples. Last week, I mentioned Acts 15 while Lauren did this presentation, where the apostles, in resolving an issue, said, let's settle on these few things that we want you to follow. We're talking about which practices the Gentile converts had to adopt. Let's agree on a few things and leave the rest to the Holy Spirit to guide you. And this has been described in today's terms as centered set thinking versus bounded set thinking. And this is the whole issue of permission-giving leadership. Okay, how can a leader settle on the most critical things for the organization and give a lot of space, room for innovation, for creativity, for action? Centered set, bounded set. And the illustration that a couple of missiologists used to describe this was the ranches in Australia, I believe, where you could drive for miles and see these ranches. And you have two kinds. You have the ones with fence posts and fences to keep the cattle in and keep the marauders out. Fences. In other settings where the rancher would decide that he would dig a well and provide a source of water, in which case the cattle will pretty much hang around near the water. And you translate that into the church system, you could say the bounded set is thinking that says you need these fence posts, 29 of them right now, doctrines, you need those, and people are either in or out in relation to the fence, either in or out. Or you could have a centered set. You could decide that the most important thing about our faith is Jesus Christ. the gospel, salvation by grace alone, by faith alone, in Christ alone, and draw people to what Jesus said, that if he is lifted up, will draw all people to him. And there the issue is not whether somebody's in or out, but whether someone is facing toward the middle or facing outward, and how close they may be. There are no in and outs. If a entity can determine what the centered set is and say you are free to pursue your ministry, your mission in any way that God is directing you to, chances are there will be more accomplished. We can talk more about some of this if you have questions. So what are some of the characteristics of empowering leadership? This is, I think, my last or almost last slide here. Empowering leaders are clear about the goals and purposes of their roles. They discern what's working and lend support. They are encouraging and supportive of those they lead. They identify with the people they lead. They do not see themselves as a different class or a superior class with greater wisdom. They help give focus and definition to a group's vision. If a group is unable or is struggling to find focus, an empowering leader helps them to find that focus. Sometimes developing a mission or even pursuing a mission, ministry can cause conflict and division. An empowering leader can play a huge role in keeping the group united, seeking win-win solutions when there's conflict, exercising leadership authority appropriately. And in the church, in the denomination, there is some authority that goes with positions. There is positional power. And how one uses that makes a difference, whether you're an empowering leader or an authoritarian leader. Listen to the wisdom available to them. And empowering leaders are permission giving. We are all leaders in whatever configuration we find ourselves, in a family, in a relationship, in a church, and our leadership influence is felt and changes based on where we are in the configuration of the church or of the family. We are all leaders. We all have influence, and we are always bringing that influence to others. So that is the end of what I have to say, Lauren. For now, I've gone very long here. To remind you of some of the questions, these need not be what we discussed, but I would be interested, and maybe you would be, what kind of leadership works best for you? How do you like to be led? Talk to us about something that a leader did that was successful, that you are pleased about. And the opposite, when a leader might have killed a successful initiative. And about our time now, what do you believe are leadership skills, strengths that will work, that we need for now, not just what was needed in the past?
I have to say, one of the stories that you told I was part of, and that is the two churches merging their church schools. When it happened, I thought it was just amazing. Suddenly we had a bigger church school. And I remember when some of the board members of the two schools started talking like, well, we don't like these other people and we're not getting along with them. Some of the teachers came to me and were just heartbroken. They said, we love this group of students. We love our fellow teachers. We are just having a great time. This is working wonderfully. And it could not stand up against the desires of the patriarchal lay leaders in the church. And to me, that was like a really great example of how these things work. Now, Robert T. Johnston, I'm going to ask you to start this conversation. Go ahead and unmute.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to ask two questions, if I may, and I'm going to ask about leadership at the, I guess you'd say, starting at the top and starting at the bottom, although with an inverted view of leadership, maybe we'd flip that around. If I look at the situation in the world today, I know there are those that are making arguments that nations like China in particular are moving very quickly and able to adapt very quickly to changing environments because of their authoritarian leadership style. And when I look at the companies, if you think about the companies that have dominated our economy in recent times and that are in the news, you think of founder entrepreneurs like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, Elon Musk. So my question is democratic leadership in the church still viable, or is it too constrained by committees and constituencies and so on to be able to change in changing times, as you put it? In other words, is the pace of change outpacing our structure's ability to adapt and change in a timely fashion? And then the second question I'll ask after we talk about that.
Well, I don't know whether you are wanting my take on this, Robert. My sense for a while now has been that the changes that we are experiencing this year in the West are such that the models of leadership are inadequate. We are not dependent, as we may have been once upon a time, on a hierarchical, or may not be dictatorial, but at least a strong leadership style. And so I think that the changes that have happened, the sources of information that we have access to, the kinds of communities that we are able to create and enjoy, how we're able to organize ourselves to pursue a goal, a mission. These things are not dependent on the kind of leadership that we might have been once upon a time. So my short answer might be yes, we need to discover different ways on how to lead in today's environment.
Is the dictator what we need? I mean, I hate to say that, but on the other hand, when I look at these business models, it seems like the most successful companies, and certainly one of the fastest ramping up countries, are those that are led by very strong leaders who basically control the process.
Well, I think another way to frame this is to say, if we did have a dictatorial leader, will we follow him or her? Okay, is our psyche right now, our collective psyche, such that if we did have one, that we would say, yeah, we will follow. You know, John Maxwell used to say, if you think you're a leader, but nobody is following, you're just taking a walk. And if we had a dictatorial leader, but we are not, as a community, ready to accept that kind of leadership, will it make a difference? And my sense is that in the church, we're not ready, we're not there to accept that kind of leadership. I may be wrong. This is my take on it.
Robert.
I guess
Go ahead, Robert.
Yes?
Finish up.
Okay. Well, that leads into the second question then, maybe. And going to the local level, as we look at church congregations and leadership models at the local level, do we need strong founder entrepreneur type leaders, or do we, again, look at a very democratic process? I see a lot of dysfunctionality, frankly, in the way the democratic process operates within the church. But in this context, something that I've seen, it seems like there's a tension in terms of discussion is between this idea that the church needs to empower the lay people. We don't need a lot of professional pastors. We have conferences that don't even want to hire from the seminary. We have a lot of recent convert evangelist type pastors that come through and are leading congregations. And then the argument that the countries that are growing the fastest are those in which, in terms of membership, are those in which they have the highest ratio of churches per pastor. I've seen that argument proposed many times. And so this kind of view is one that sort of diminishes the role of the pastor, makes him strictly maybe a teacher for the lay people or something, but doesn't provide that. Certainly not the strong, I'll call it the founder entrepreneur type leadership function. How do we move forward? I think congregations do require a well-trained pastor, if nothing else, to withstand the crazies that assault us all the time from some of the online sources and videos that get circulated and so forth. But be interested in your take on how we move ahead in a church where we tend to move pastors around fairly quickly, where it seems like the role of pastor at the local level is perhaps underemphasized.
Well, I am a strong believer in well-trained, theologically trained pastors. I think the ability of a pastor to open the word and with credibility be able to teach and explain it, I think is a critical role. And so I am certainly not for these fly-by-night training institutes and places that are churning out so-called pastors. I believe there's a role for that. Now, I also believe that the context makes a difference in terms of the other aspects of leadership. There are congregations, big and small, where there are people who are well equipped, skilled, able to provide leadership in planning, in executing plans. And there the pastor needs to be able to support them, encourage them, and so on. But then there are contexts, I think, where a congregation may be more dependent on a pastor to provide the framework for planning and leading. So I think it depends. The one size certainly does not fit all. But I believe that in terms of theological training, pastors should get the best that is available and be skilled at teaching the word in a way that is sound. So whatever it's worth, that's where I am.
I agree. I think we need to invest more in our pastors if we want to flatten the hierarchy. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let me talk to both Robert and Raj here. Something that occurred to me as you were talking. I was at the 2018 General Conference Executive Committee in Battle Creek. I think I've got the date right. And I was sitting there as they were starting up this thing about compliance committees. And along with just about everybody else from the NAD, I was sitting there and just fuming. Just how on earth can he be so overbearing? How can these people stand up there and they are so strong and so overbearing? What's going on? This does not work for us. And I happened to say this to a friend of mine from the General Conference, and he said, "No, you're wrong." I said, "How am I wrong?" He said, "I have been with Ted Wilson when he does meetings and rallies and so forth in Latin America and Africa." And he said, "He is extraordinary. The people love his leadership style. They respond to it. They'll do almost anything. He just brings people to their feet." And it made me realize, Raj, that this is our view that we're expressing here is probably somewhat of a localized phenomenon. Do you think that could be what we're talking about here?
I think there's pretty good consensus, my sense is, in this group as to our worldview, how we see issues and so on. But this is not typical. I think there are congregations everywhere that would see things very differently than how we see it. And so, but I'm not too sure that itself changes a whole lot the kind of leadership that we would receive or be willing to receive.
Interesting. Charlie?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I sure can, yes.
Okay. Yeah, just a comment. We talk a lot about leadership, but what about kind of flipping that? Is there anything that we should be doing to train members on what the obligations of membership are? I pointed out in the chat, I belong to a multicultural church, and we have a lot of members from Africa, from Central America, who when you're sitting in a meeting for a ministry, they say, well, what does the pastor want us to do? And it's like, well, there are a bunch of us that say, well, what does the mission say we ought to do? And we have this conflict, and part of it comes, I think, because I remember being young. When I was young, I mean, what the pastor said, generally went. And it was because the pastor was typically the most educated person in the church. They had been to college and they had a seminary degree, most likely. That's not true anymore, at least in North America and Europe. And I think the rest of the world is going to catch up to that. So is there something that we need to be doing as a church to train our members and what their obligation is, holding leadership accountable, making sure we keep on track in the mission and things like that?
Yeah, Charlie, I think there is room for that. But I also recognize how difficult that is. You know how it is. You call for a church meeting to do training in one thing or the other, and the same people show up who show up for every other training event, and it becomes very difficult to broaden the base. I'm familiar with the Church of the Brethren there in Polaris, Lauren, the big church out there. When they assimilated somebody into their congregation, they had a one-on-one interview with each person, and they negotiated the kind of ministry they would be willing to be engaged in. So you just couldn't just blend in with the crowd as just another number. They were very intentional. Now, if we did that, I don't know whether we could pull that off in the Adventist church. Say, if you're going to belong to this community, here's what we expect of you to do, besides believing in whatever number of doctrines that we expect them to believe. We don't focus on individual responsibility when we assimilate people into the congregation. And that may be one thing we can do differently, Charlie. That may be one thing we can do different. But I've seen these training things of let's get people all trained on how to do this better. And as I say, in most cases, the same people show up as do for most other training things. And that's been my experience.
Yeah, and that's kind of been mine too. It's a little frustrating. I had to, here at the beginning of the year, we tried to do in our local church discipleship training, and this includes, this is not mainly theologically based, but more practical based. How do you establish a practical devotion life, practical prayer life? What does practical stewardship mean? And I had to kick it off, and I based it on the book. I don't know if you've read the book by Tom Rainer, I Am a Member, which has like 5 basic sections. It's a good book where he talks about what the obligations of a Christian are to a community. And to me, it seems, if somehow that could get traction, and we could find the magic leader that could make this all happen, of course, that might go a long way to alleviating a lot of the conflicts that we have between, leaders and members.
Good point. Yep.
Thanks very much. Uh, I'm going to, Harry, I see you're there and you're unmuted.
Yeah. A success.
And you're outdoors with oxen today, I see.
Actually, this is for the Sabbath school lesson today.
Oh, okay.
Success. So when I was in Pennsylvania, we had Bill Lovelace come in, and he set up ministeriums for the pastors to work as teams. And I got to have the good fortune of being in the ministerium that Monty Celine was in. And we did case studies, and we supported each other, and we did innovation. And I felt like that was one of the very most successful experiences I had in pastoral leadership. It was supportive, it was instructive, it was engaging, it was innovative, it was energizing. And while I was there, I got moved to Gettysburg. And with Monty's help, when I landed in Gettysburg, I had read a little piece called "Running Through the Thistles" about pastors in transition. And the point was, the little kid ran through when he was young, he had to walk to school in bare feet. And he thought that if he would run through the field with thistles, it wouldn't hurt him so much. And as he got older, he found that if he walked carefully, it was much better than running through the thistles. But most of the time in our transitions, we tend to just jump in and try to change things. So I decided I wouldn't change anything. The people got impatient. And Monty had taught us a way to ask the congregation what they wanted to do and to prioritize those things in a systematic way, and that negated the loudest speaker, but identified mathematically the consensus of the group. We did that. We selected 3 priorities. It was like falling out of a plane without the parachute open. There was no stress. There was no strain. The congregation was enthused. They had focus. They moved out. For 3 years, they just kind of plowed ahead. Nobody had to touch anything. It was their energy. It was their mission. And it was what they wanted to do. And so those were a couple successes that I encountered. One of the failures that I encountered was part of that same scenario. I had started becoming very effective in my local congregation. And the reason I was told later by the following administration that I got moved from the Pittsburgh area to the Gettysburg area was that the new conference president, who was not Bill Lovelace, had decided I'd become too powerful, and he needed to break up that effectiveness. At the time, I was going to Pittsburgh Seminary, and one of my fellow students in my class, he was the 4th pastor in a Presbyterian church that was 100 years old. Every pastor had a tenure of 25 years in that particular congregation. I have prayed and thought about this leadership thing, and I've had an opportunity to do some community leadership. A leader is no better than the group he's leading, and the group is really no better than the leader that they have. It's a tragic kind of thing. And when we have innovation, pockets of innovation, there are pockets of lack of understanding that they meet up with, and there's always this conflict. And even though you can have pockets of success, I don't think we'll ever see a broad engagement. And when I do sociology of religion, movements are different than denominations, and movements, though, is where the vitality is. And I sometimes wonder, something's got to happen where we become that movement again. And how that's going to happen, it's going to be stressful. It's going to be jarring, I'm pretty sure. One of the books I've run across is called As One. It talks about 12 different kinds of organizational function. I don't think we understand organizational function very well. And when I had an opportunity to do chair community organizations, I found out I'm not sure how well we understand governance. So those are just issues on my heart that I just keep praying for our congregation, for our church, for the work, whatever it's going to come on. Maybe it's going to be under a different brand name. I don't know. But just there is hope. But I think there's a tragic humanness about us as well.
Yeah, thank you, Harry. I'm thinking about Raj, that idea. I don't know if you ever heard this. I was told this directly by my first conference president. He said, we have to keep pastors moving because we don't want any congregation to get attached to the pastor instead of to the denomination. Do you remember that being spoken of when you were young?
I heard about that. No, the president that I worked with did not say that to me. I never heard them say it, but I did hear that used to be said quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was reading an old novel about the Methodist Church, and they back in the 1800s, they would read out where you were going to go the next year at camp meeting, and they said it very, very clearly there. Pastors are not should not become the reason people come to church, which I thought was quite fascinating.
When I came to Ohio, Lauren, I believe the average tenure of a pastor was slightly over 2 years in a church. So every 2 years or so, the conferences owned moving trucks, moving vans, because we were moving pastors so much, it made financial sense for the conference to own their own moving rigs. But 2 years just over was the average.
Yeah. A lovely couple who here in Worthington actually went to the Eastwood Church, but they lived here in Worthington. He taught down at Eastwood. They came into my office one day and said, we need somebody to talk to about this. And they sat down and told me the story about how they had left ministry for teaching because they had been moved so often. In fact, one night they were sitting down to dinner and the moving truck drove up and they said, nobody told us. Oh, they didn't? Well, you have to be ready to move by tomorrow night. And these people were in tears. They were heartbroken about how they had been treated in ministry. This is kind of off topic. I was also going to add, Raj, that's something that we need to think about. And what Charlie said made me think about this. What kind of pastors do we want, or what kind of training, or what kind of, how do we create the kind of congregation leadership that we want? I have a sense, maybe I'm wrong, but I have a sense that most people in the Adventist church are not there for sort of an open sense of what they can contribute. They're there because we have the truth in some sense. I mean, the bonding, the reason for being together is different than the Brethren Church you were talking about. Did you have that sense?
Yeah, and I think the pool from which we recruit people into membership is a pool that is kind of drawn to the conspiracies and the beasts of prophecy and those kinds of things that the belief system, the cognitive seems to be the drawing, not so much service and ministry.
The sense of being the ones who are right.
Yeah,
Raj, if after most of your life training and working here in North America, if you went back to Sri Lanka, do you think you would have to change your leadership style?
Yeah, I think I would have to. I would have to somehow turn myself into an authoritarian of some sort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Austin Archer.
At least present myself as knowing all the answers and being able to give orders on how others can get it done. Mm-hmm. I will need to change. Yeah.
Austin Archer had mentioned early on, and I took note of this, Austin, and I hope you do join the conversation. Austin Archer from Walla Walla University. He said our leadership should match our mission, and our mission, but also the people that we're directing, which is interesting. Steve, I was jumping off what you said about how your methodology, the methodology your immigrant church asked you for. That's what I was jumping off of. Lynn Boyd?
Yeah, I just finished actually teaching a class in management where we had a chapter on leadership. And some of the things I think might apply here. Leadership requires that the leader take the situation into consideration. And definitely a leadership in another culture is different from a leadership elsewhere. So I think that's fundamental. We don't think we need to discuss that much further. You just have to find out what kind of leadership is appropriate for that culture. And that's not always easy, but it can be done.
Did you find that in Africa?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that. I'm not surprised at all at the observation made earlier about the president being very welcomed in Africa and South America. That sort of leadership is what they're used to. And in leadership theory, we talk about two sorts of leaders: a transformational leader and a transactional leader. A transactional leader uses different kinds of power to lead than a transformational leader does. We have power from position, which we call legitimate power in theory. We have a power for reward, which usually goes with this legitimate power, that is a hierarchical structure. And a lot of us have experienced that power and fear of losing our reward if we kind of crossed the power that we made them upset, or we did something where a local congregation might complain and we would lose our position. Some of you are aware of that, I think. They use also coercive power. These are all transactional types of power that leaders in business use. And the metaphor of business leaders in the church might be a little bit applicable here, but the church is a volunteer organization. It's not I suppose work is too, but it's not quite the same as work. You've got church members who you don't pay, and you're leading those people in a way. You have to use the transformational power, which some people call soft power, but it's what is described in most books as referent power. People follow people that they respect, that who are authentic, who have expertise, So the referent power and the expert power we see in business a lot, where you may have gotten into a situation where somebody has a position of authority, but in fact somebody else is running the organization who might be their subordinate. They have more power with the informal power than the person who is in authority that has power. So
This
we
actually
see
often happens in churches, Lynn.
Yeah.
Where the pastor says, "I'd like to lead you in doing something," and the patriarch or matriarch says, "No, you're not."
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think we've all, if we've been in churches long enough, we've seen these forces at work. These complicate the whole idea of leadership very much, and to transform, as I'm trying to remember the gentleman that talked about becoming a movement again. To become a movement, to get people excited, is actually the goal of many of the business leaders nowadays. Jeff Bezos is known for getting his people really excited, for example, and Elon Musk as well. And it feels, as they describe it to many of the employees in these meetings, as if they're in a revival meeting or they're in a movement. They're not in some business that doesn't mean anything. And of all the businesses to be in that should mean something, it seems to me like a religious organization should have the advantage there. One thing we noticed when we worked with other cultures, we would go into a community and try to change that community's habits for to better the community. And we found that changing people and people's habits is just so difficult. But if we could get them excited about it for their own benefit, then they would change themselves.
Let me bring Raj into this, Lynn, because Raj, when I worked for you, I never.
Lauren, how about saying when I worked with you, then worked for you?
Okay,
Huge
well,
difference.
when you were my conference president, I don't remember that any of our meetings that we had that you did either rah, you guys got to go, come on, get with me here, we're excited, or even that you ever tried to manipulate us spiritually. Let me really bring this to a heart-wrenching, weeping sort of thing. Your sort of style was much more intellectual and here's some ideas. Let's talk about these ideas. I did have that kind of leadership. And for me personally, I absolutely despised it. I just could hardly stand it. I hated every moment of it. I objected to it. Everything in me pushed back at it. But that's apparently, from what Lynn says and from what others have said about the effectiveness of leadership around the world, that's not true for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think you're right, Lauren. We try to put a lot of focus on hiring pastors, the kinds of pastors we hired, and we spent time looking at, I think, what has come to be known as the 3 C's: character, competence, and chemistry. Do you fit in here? And competence, are you able to do what needs to be done? Once you hire people and give them responsibility, if you don't respect that, that can be demeaning. So if you hire people that you believe can do the ministry, are equipped for it, have the competence and the character, then the thing to do, I felt, was to respect that and to support them. And furthermore, I didn't ever feel like I knew what that one thing is, which if all of us could sign into, that this thing is going to, we're going to flourish, things are going to succeed, because ministry is contextual. Mm-hmm. What one community needs, another does not. So for those reasons, I think I did what we did.
And I think cerebral people tend to attract other cerebral people.
Yeah, yeah.
But I do remember that we had pastors in our field who objected very much to that. They wanted a different kind of church.
Yeah.
They wanted to impose it on all of us, and even went as far as publicly complaining about the conference that they were hired by, which always kind of blew my mind. Eric?
Following up on what Lynn said, I'm wondering what it is that we can discover as a community that would ignite the interest and the passion of people to say, I want to be part of this thing. I want to make this success, as some of the business leaders that Lynn, you mentioned, are able to do, whether it's Elon Musk or anybody else. What is it that we have to discover that would ignite that sense of excitement and passion in people? I don't think the 29 fundamentals are doing it.
I'm very flattered that you think that there are now 29, just because I had that presentation last week.
Well, I took it to mean that this is official, Lauren, when you said 29.
So I managed to add a 29th fundamental belief. I'm really flattered that you take it that way. Eric,
yes,
you are on. Eric is in Iceland.
Yes, thank you. And let me first celebrate the Madeline Steele Johnson background picture. It makes me feel like home. She's not seeing it. Anyway, someone that is living on innovation, living and dying on innovation, I would like to add a few things. First of all, just try to Google Adventist and innovation. It turns up zero. It just almost doesn't exist. And how do you find leaders with a theology that sort of everything is chiseled in stone in the past and everything might end tomorrow? There is nothing between them. And there are so many thoughts after this presentation that are just mind-boggling. Innovation, change in thoughts, changes in strategy, it's just not in our DNA. We're always looking back towards what is chiseled in stone, and then there is no future. And we are behaving as an organization like that. Unfortunately, we are not seeing the vision of Christ. We are not seeing the vision of Christ. Let's get together. Let's merge. Let's listen to each other. I'm now reading Matt Ridley's latest book, How Innovation Works. Matt Ridley is a he writes in the Telegraph here in Europe for the London daily paper. A great mind. What I thought with the authors, what you said, Rai, you need to do this for the rest of the year. Look, we need to get together and we need to think. When Wikipedia was invented, when Google was invented, they were not striving for that. It came later. They were looking for other solutions. They were looking for just the explosion of the mind. Let's find something that works in gathering information. Let's, so first of all, thank you. I don't have a question. I really have a statement. This future, this strategy is just not in our theology. It's not in the DNA of the church, and that worries me terribly. Thank you.
You know, Raj, that's a really interesting thing to add to our discussion on leadership. I don't know that I've thought of it quite like that before. Officially, we don't have a future. I mean, I've thought at times that we build awfully big buildings for people who say Jesus is going to come next week. You know, if we really thought that it was all coming to a close, we probably would just have some pop-ups setting on cement blocks, but we don't. We're pretty well invested in infrastructure, and it does make me wonder what Eric says. Are we leading differently because we don't think there's a future?
Well, I don't know how many of us in this forum actually believe that there is no future. You know, traditional Adventist theology might nudge people to think that, you know, everything is going to end here in a day or two, if it's going to burn up, so why build? But while our theology might be saying that, I don't know how many of us believe that. You know, when I buy a house, I intend to stay there for a while. I hope it holds up for a while.
Mm.
I'm not intending it all to burn up in a day or two. But
you and I both saved in our 401k plans.
That's right. Yeah, and that's interesting that a denomination that says it's all going to end does have a retirement, or did have a retirement plan, and did talk us into the 401b plan and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, Eric. I think we have to talk about that a little more. To what extent is that true? That we don't plan for the future. But you know what might be true, Eric, is that we have adopted a more hierarchical structure because we're unsure about the future. I think that's something worth considering. My old friend Ken James here. Ken was my church member back in Palo Alto. Ken, nice to see you. I hope you and Janice are well.
We're all well. And I just had one comment about it was Bob in the beginning about the difference between the church and industry such as Bill Gates and Phil Knight. Well, they run those industries quite different than we run our church. And I believe the reason for that is that their goal in the industry is quite different than our goal in the running our church.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all I need to say, but I just wanted to make that point, okay? Thank you.
Yeah, you know that, Raj. I think we do have that. This is a good point, and this reminds me. What Ken said reminds me of a lot of comments I'm following here in the chat, with a lot of people saying not just that our goal is different. It certainly is different. We're not going for profits, for example, necessarily. But not only is our goal different, but a lot of people have been mentioning things like we should lead like Jesus did. There should be a spiritual component to leadership, that we should, that what we do should be like Jesus. Now, I tend to be, as I think you are too, a preacher from the Gospels, from the New Testament. And for me particularly, my last 15, 20 years, I preach from the Gospels exclusively. But is there a Jesus leadership model that works for a huge organized church with billions of dollars of revenue and 20 million members. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, from what we read, we can tell that Jesus mixed with people. He identified with them. He recognized their needs, and he did what he could to meet those needs. And he did not, and he was inclusive. Everyone had a place at the table. I would say that if we can emulate that, we would be far off in implementing the model of Jesus' leadership. How that translates into a organizational structure and hierarchy, I don't know, but as individuals, that's what we can do. And I might also mention something that in connection to what was said earlier, because of this belief that things are going to end soon, we might not be investing in changing and improving the quality of life of people as much as we should in terms of getting involved in issues of justice and fairness and mercy. That's what Jesus did. And so to me, the Jesus model would be, let's advocate for goodness and righteousness and justice and fairness and caring for people.
And our friend Olive Hemmings, who has the key thought in Olive's work is that the word righteousness actually refers to active work, justice work. It's not an inner piety, it's actual justice. And so that has affected me a great deal, Olive, and I want to thank you for bringing that into my world here. Dr. Liebert, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and unmute and join this conversation.
Thank you, Lord. Raj, when I read your first essay yesterday, I forwarded it to a friend of mine who is a conference president in the Inter-American Division, because he's always asking me for books, or he knows that I have a tremendous background in bibliography. So he's always asking for books dealing with leadership. He's really interested in that. So I sent him your essay because I thought that was a really good one for him to look at.
Thank you.
Now, I have another question, which is for the group, because I think for the schools of us who are here, you might be able to help me. I'm looking for a dissertation that was written by a Seventh-day Adventist somewhere around the late 1970s, because it is my Hebrew language and my Hebrew prophets teacher who told me about it. He's somewhere in California. And his argument in that dissertation is this, that the Adventist church is organized no different from the Soviet Union. That was his argument in the dissertation. I've been looking for it because this teacher used to write to me and he told me about this, and I lost the name of the author, because in those days it was not internet, it was communication through mail and so forth. So I don't remember who is that author. I know he was from California. I know he was an Adventist, and I know that the dissertation exists. That's my only beg and plea now, if anybody can help me find that, because his argument is, and I remember the argument, is that the Adventist church is organized exactly like the Soviet Union. That time there was Soviet Union.
Well, Dr. Liebert, I'm going to look for that myself now. I'm not aware of it, and I don't know if Raj is aware of it.
No, I'm not aware of it.
This guy knew what he was talking about. By the time I got into bibliographic work and was working with this, I had lost the name. I did everything I could to find that dissertation, but I know it exists. It's written in North America.
Fascinating. Well, we will look for that. I will say that I have pounded so hard on this notion that we Adventists love administration more than we love congregations, that I've had people just angry at me about this, but I think it's true. I think we are addicted to organization. I have said many times, Raj, I could be wrong, but I've said many times that there are people who would rather say we have a conference office than say we have a congregation. Mm-hmm. And because it's just that important. I remember taking my first tour of the General Conference headquarters and people walking around just in holy awe and saying, this is where it all happens. This is our church right here. And I've never felt that way. I mean, I felt like my church is where I gather with people I know, not where the General Conference office is, but that's just me. Somebody wrote here, Mark Carr said, I think I agree with Eric in the sense that we do not allow for any alternatives to our view of the future. And that may be true. As soon as we start a conversation that reaches the edges of the standard view of the future, we get shut down. I don't know, Raj, what your reaction to that would be. Frank writes, despite the fact that most biblical scholarship concerning eschatology and apocalyptic literature has moved so far beyond the conspiracy theory eschatology of Adventist historicism. And as you did point out, Raj, there is a strong sense of the conspiratorial. I just got a newsletter this morning that was sent to Adventist Today, where an Adventist evangelist is saying that more people, this is an evangelist, more people are dying from the vaccine than are dying from COVID. And I thought this is extraordinary. And yet it's being put out there as a sort of part of the package of Adventist eschatology, which is interesting.
I do want to say something that you just read from Mark Carr, I think. I've not been following the chat here, but I think there is probably validity and opportunity to explore what alternate futures might look like and what that might mean in terms of eschatology. Might be a scary place to go, but it might be something quite stimulating to engage in.
Yeah, I wrote an article and taught a class on an article that I wrote in Adventist Today, saying it's too late for Jesus to come soon.
Yeah.
And it was quite provocative. People really some people embraced the idea and some people were absolutely furious with me. And had there been a pile of stones nearby, I think they would have at least held the coats. So I'm going to go to Ray, or I don't know who's speaking, Ray or Bobby, but I'm going to let them decide. Hello, Stovals, how are you?
Howdy. I'm going to be a bit repetitive along with my remarks because it seems in this discussion that we all assume we know what the mission and vision of the church is. Now, in meetings and training seminars on management and everything else, one of the first things we always discuss, what's our mission, what's our vision? And that determined where we went from there. So I'm wondering, do we have, or do we need a worldwide mission and vision? Or are those things should be more local level, whether it's conference countries or whatever? But if we took a vote, or not a vote, but if we asked the question, what is the mission and vision written down someplace? How many people within the church would realize or understand or even know what it is?
Oops.
No, I think we got a glitch in Ray's, but the question is a really interesting one, Raj. I would imagine that there's quite a few different visions and missions. When I worked here in Ohio, it was always clear that the mission and vision was a grace-oriented gospel one, not an eschatological one primarily. It didn't exclude the eschatological, but if I remember correctly, and I understood correctly what was going on, it generally had to do with the gospel first and the other things as part of that story.
Yeah, I think Ray might be back on, or is he? Nope.
Oh, sadly, I think we lost Ray. I think yeah. Anyway, where are they? Ray, are you still there? If you are, raise your hand again and we'll let you finish. But in any case, that's true. Do we need a mission and vision for everyone? Or are we okay with having an individual mission and vision? I've always been frustrated with these statements. Raj, you and I have talked about this in the past. When I did ask one of my churches to do a mission and vision statement, basically they put in it, it was a grocery list. It was everything that we could possibly ever do or need. And I found it utterly useless. They worked hard at it, but it was mostly an exercise in word crafting, not a really look within to see what makes us different or what makes us unique or what makes us do what we want to do. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Sure. And related to that is the issue of how excited can a person be in investing in something written by a committee or a group in the church or far away. I'm sure there are thousands of mission statements sitting around all over the place that the people in the front lines did not participate in crafting. I'm sure I know mission statements have their place and vision statements, but our dilemma is that the further they are from where the people are in being crafted, the less impact they have.
And I sometimes wondered whether the people on the front line actually had much of a mission or a vision of their own. I think they probably would have read the ones that the committee crafted and said, yeah, that's it. We should do all these things. We should serve people. We should have correct theology. We should have good worship. All these sort of standard things, but none of it really was motivating in a sense. Okay, Ed, you're next.
Okay, well, we'll have a brief prayer then.
Thank you.
Father, today we are reminded how frail humanity is and how prone to dysfunctionality we can be and how we struggle to get it right. And this in your church. We're almost reminded of ancient Israel, who kept wandering about and couldn't get it right. But we pray that your guiding hand will overcome our human frailty and that our church will be a testimony to your love. We thank you for this opportunity to fellowship together. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Ed. Give us some wisdom here.
Oh, no, I have no wisdom.
Yes, you do.
I'm not quite sure if Eric is the right pronunciation, or Araklur.
He goes just by Eric.
Eric, okay. I really resonated with what he said. I suspect professionally we're somewhat akin. And I confess that I've become a bit disillusioned with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Maybe that's a bad thing to say, but it is true. And it probably comes from the fact that in my nature is to move to the next thing. I was one of the founding executives of Advent Health in Orlando, which went from a $100 million organization when it was founded to today it's $15 to $16 billion organization, which successfully executes its mission. And since we were in startup mode, once a year, sometimes twice, I would sit back and stare out the window a while and say, where do we need to go next? When you're building an organization, you need to ask yourself, what's next? What competency do we need to acquire? What structure do we need to put into place, et cetera, et cetera. And so I come from that kind of a background, and it's my natural inclination anyway. But it feels to me like the church is absolutely stuck on almost every dimension. And it's hard to separate the subject of leadership, which I think Raj did a beautiful job talking about. It's hard to separate leadership from organizational movement, because a lot of time it's leaders that make things happen. They move on to the next thing. And I just feel like we're set in concrete. It's almost like we think we have arrived. And that goes right along with the concept of the truth. When you say the in front of truth, it kind of embodies a set of knowledge that there isn't anymore. It's the truth. We got it all. We're there, and this is so stuck. And I feel like leadership in the Adventist church today is all about preserving the status quo. Now, when somebody like Raj Attiken sticks up his hand in his union conference and says, you know, we need to reorganize, we could save a lot of money and be more efficient and so on and so forth, and immediately gets squashed. That is stuckness. That is not encouraging innovation. It is a killer to innovation. And so everybody knows the score, and they stay in line and they preserve the status quo, because innovation is not rewarded. Innovation is punished. And I don't know why that's true. I think perhaps one of the factors is that there is, in our denomination, the way we're structured, and it has really good points and it has really bad points how we're structured, but everybody can say no and nobody can say yes. There are constituencies everywhere that delight in saying no. There are boards here that delight in saying no, and nobody's empowered to say yes. And so we preserve the status quo. Now, how do we get out of that? Is it possible to get out of that? I can see some possible catalysts to change, but I don't know how they get going. Number one, I had never heard of the bordered versus centered sets, Raj. That was valuable information. What if we moved to a centered set where there were no outsiders? I went and read about it while you were talking. That has some potential to free us up to think differently about church life. I think one powerful potential as a catalyst to change things is if we took to heart Jesus' admonition that the kingdom of heaven is here, it is among you. And we have been so focused on pointing people at a future kingdom that we've kind of neglected the kingdom is here concept. And if we took care of the kingdom now and was nurturing and feeding the kingdom now, I have a feeling the kingdom of the future would take care of itself and could be a powerful motivator to us to shake up how we play church. A third possible catalyst to change would be just outright financial starvation. When there ain't no money, people are forced to do something different. And I know that tithe is a theological matter. In my opinion, it's a false one. I don't think tithe is a New Testament obligation, but we could debate that all day long. But if the money weren't going upstream would change in a real hurry. The one place I know of in the church that has done significant savings actually in recent years is the General Conference. Not out of goodwill. They changed because the North American division said, we're not going to send you as much money. They were forced to change. And it happened very quickly. So financial starvation could be effective. I also think it could be effective if we clarified somehow that higher organizations really do lack authority. We know that it's in the legal documents that they don't have much authority, and Ted Wilson admitted that in one of the General Conference meetings. He said, you can't do much, you just don't have the authority. And he told the truth. He's tried to find a way around that. But if we made it crystal clear that higher organizations do not have authority, that we delegate certain things to them for them to take care of, but they're not in control, that might have some interesting repercussions.
Lots of times, Ed, they have, what I've noticed is that they say you don't have authority to do what you want to do, but you have the responsibility to take care of anything that happens in your territory. So authority without responsibility.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say is one possible catalyst to change, and the last one is radical decentralization. You know, in the 1980s, Tom Peters and his partner came out with the book In Search of Excellence, and they listed the characteristics of excellent organizations. And one of them was radical decentralization. I don't know what radical decentralization would look like in our church, but in decentralization, you push authority and accountability and responsibility out. You don't try to retain it somewhere, you push it out. And I feel like that could be a catalyst to change. But, you know, even if these catalysts to change, I'm worried about the leadership that happened. Because that's not the way your leadership thinks, as Erica so aptly pointed out to us. I think maybe leadership will have to arise at the level of the images on this screen, where we take leadership and say, hey, no more. Now, figuring out how to say that and make it stick is a challenge, but I have a feeling that more leadership is needed at our level among us. The guys upstairs will not do it. Actually, I'd like to say the guys downstairs. The guys downstairs will not do it. It's not in their interests. And so, I don't know, I throw that out as a challenge.
I think I would have more ability to lead all of you, Ed, if I could figure out a way of taking up an offering from you. I haven't figured that out yet. But yeah, that's you make some really good points. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think I can sign on to what Ed was saying here. I would say, however, that innovation change often happens in the margins, right, in the edges. And I think there are congregations where things are happening. We may not capture them on our radar, but there are things happening at least in some congregations, that are quite radical and energizing, and out of the ordinary in terms of mainstream Adventism. So if we can nurture more of those, maybe in time there'll be a critical mass. Maybe that's another catalyst.
We have one of our members here up the Dingles up in Cleveland who has started an alternative sort of a little church that's primarily emphasizing service, and it's really interesting. I hope to visit it someday. Thank you very much, Ed. Sometime, Ed, I want to ask you about health systems, arguably the most successful part of Seventh-day Adventism. And while church in North America is one of the less successful, I'd like to kind of know whether there's something to be learned there. Mitchum Barnett, young pastor up in Quebec. Mitchum, I would love to have you join this conversation.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Internet's kind of spotty, but I'm just wondering about when we always talk about leadership. We always talk about, dynamic changes and all that stuff. But I found that upon entering the church, they want you to make magnificent changes, but you have to do everything the same way. In terms of the way you evangelize, the way you approach people. One of my questions is that how do you use a group that is more ethnically inclined to talk to their own than they are to reach the people who are around them, because North America is, a microcosm of many different ethnic groups that, sits in a population that is predominantly of another group. And very often you just see these clusters of groups in the corner, and there's no really multiculturalism heavy inside our small churches. It's more like one group here, one group there. So, as you say, we have all these mission statements, these vision statements, and I agree with you kind of, because you can spend a whole academic year talking about what's our mission, what's our vision, but when it actually comes to boots on the ground, it's a different story. I mean, I like giving blood, but I know a church that doesn't want to ever hear about blood donation. So how do you reach people when you have ideas that can connect with a group, but giving blood is not really something that you want to talk to 60-something-year-old members or elders who are pretty much fixed in their ways. I mean, I got crucified for trying to change communion. So how do we change our approach?
Those are fairly modest changes, Mitchum. To get people to give blood. Now that's something I did successfully at one of my churches. I invited the blood team in to come while we were having church, and they would be called out one by one while we were, and people said, yeah, but they're not listening to your sermon. I said, I'd rather have them give blood than listen to my sermon. That's way more important than my sermon. And so, yeah, that sometimes those things work, but that's fascinating. You're absolutely right. Change everything, but don't change anything. Cherry Ann.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I was a bit cautious about sharing today because this is a topic I'm passionate about. And when I read Raj's article last week, I immediately shared it with a few elders and leaders, because I've experienced good leadership and very bad leadership. And one of the things that I find that helps with good leadership is when the culture of the leader and the culture of the congregation are really aligned. And I saw that when I was growing up, and we had a leader. I think he served, 2 terms. I think the terms are either 4 or 5 years. So he was our pastor for a pretty long time, and then they decided to change. And that for me was disappointing, because while that particular pastor was with us in Montego Bay, the congregation grew. We started to, we had to be putting chairs on the outside, and then we decided to buy property to build a bigger church and all of this. And then they changed the pastor who came in. He really didn't buy into the vision of the church, and so people started leaving. And then they did eventually this bigger church, but no. they don't have the people to fill it. And so I see the importance of having that congruence between the pastor and the congregation. And the church that I'm a part of now, it's not yet a church, it's a company, and we set up our vision statements and we did our 5-year strategic plan because we wanted to reach a particular set of people, which means we couldn't do what we've always done. And then again, after we did all of that and started getting in, we got a pastor who didn't buy into that vision. And it's been a struggle, and I find that heartbreaking. But what do you really do? Because the elders can try to influence the pastor because, pastors come and go. But there's times when you have that kind of autocratic leadership style that even though it is not in favor of what the church community wants and what they're telling you is happening on the ground, the pastor still insists on going against the grain. And that I see usually leads to disaster. But I don't know, how do we really, protect the culture that the membership know and understand is what works for them and for their mission?
Yeah, Raj, that's a good question. Did you have situations when you were leading the conference where you had a church that wanted one thing and a pastor that had an entirely different vision, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but in some way there was a mismatch?
Yeah, but I cannot recall an effective solution that we came up with for a situation like that. What it taught us, however, Sherry-Ann, is to be very intentional about pastoral placement. This may not help you right now, but in terms of matching the culture of the church with the pastor, and this is not a foolproof system, that always works, but at least making a real effort. I don't know how they do it. You're in Jamaica, right?
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they do it there, but we try to include the congregation in the process so that congregation has a voice. But even that, was not foolproof. It is an improvement than to arbitrarily assigning a pastor. But we try to pay attention. But once you're in it, like you are, I don't know that we have found a solution that can be helpful. I'm sorry.
That's fine. I don't know if anywhere in Inter-America where the congregation gets a say in the pastor that's assigned to them. That's just not something that happens. But as we spoke about leadership, the disrupting yourself is one thing that is taught in the energy industry where I work, where those who survive, and we talk about it with the tech companies, are those who disrupt themselves. They don't wait until things change to respond, but they influence the change by saying, okay, this is where I think the next thing may be going. And we've seen it where even electric utilities, who they've had monopolies and they've always done things a certain way, and they recognize renewables are becoming a thing. If we want to remain relevant, then this is one of the things that we need to do. But the church isn't a big fan of disruptive leadership at all. That's another sad thing.
The other thing I remember, Raj, is realizing that churches themselves aren't on the same page. And once you get to a certain size, you're likely to have subgroups within the church. Oh, yeah. And one group can be very much against the pastor, while probably some or most think the pastor is great. But a small group can cause enough trouble that a pastor throws up his hands and says, yeah, I don't need this. So that's always a problem too. Charlie Curting said, so what do you do if the culture, such as a very legalistic church, and that church needs to be changed? You tried very hard while you were a conference president to push us more in the direction of not being as legalistic and being more grace and gospel oriented. Did that work?
Well, it may have increased conflict in some settings, because we in our hiring of pastors, that's something we paid attention to or tried to, and hire pastors who were committed to a gospel of grace. And in some settings, that was not where the church was, but for us, that was a higher priority. that the teaching of the gospel of grace happens in our churches. Everything else was subordinate to that, which did end up causing some conflicts, but we were not willing to compromise on that.
Correct. Yeah, and it did cause some conflict in some churches. I agree. But I wonder, does teaching a certain orientation of salvation, such as a gospel orientation, change the way a church functions? Does it change the way leadership happens? I can't really say that I found that to be true.
I don't know about how the church functions and how leadership happens, but one of the things that we had Monty do, when Monty came on board to our staff, one of the things we wanted him to do was to do annual studies on our congregations, on our membership, to see whether there was a shift in our orientation more towards the gospel, less towards legalism. And that happened. That we did move the needle conference-wide in making the Ohio Conference far more gospel-centered than it was. Whether that translated to congregational life in terms of leadership and practices, I do not know.
Okay. And I've got Frank Marandino on here. Frank, tell us how you really feel.
I never do that.
It's your bashfulness that
yeah.
is a big problem.
Yeah, it's being a New York Italian, I guess.
Yeah.
Ed earlier spoke about how I heard it as organizational inertia. And I think human organizations just tend towards that, the preservation of the status quo and the preservation of the organization itself. And so add God into the mix, or belief in God into the mix, and where you're dealing with views of absolute truth that are often attached to that. And I think you can amplify the problem. And I saw this illustration that somebody used in a post over on Spectrum, talking about biblical truth, theology. And he said, if you lost your house keys, once you find them, you stop searching. And he said, that's Adventism. And I wonder how much our ideas of we have absolute truth. We have absolute truth about God. We have a prophet who tells us everything. We have absolute truth about the end times and how everything is going to unfold. How much does organizational inertia reflect that kind of spiritual zeitgeist, that kind of spiritual culture, which is not only not a biblical view of truth, it's just not fully human, and it doesn't fully acknowledge our human limitations in our need to see, to learn truth, and that truth to us is an endeavor that continually unfolds because of our humanness and our ability to discover and progress. And I just wonder, when we talk about organizational inertia or leadership problems, or the church is not moving anywhere, let's start with the fact that we're not just a human organization, but that we have a theological endeavor and task in the world. And how stuck are we there?
Thanks very much, Frank. You're making big strides in overcoming your shyness, and starting to really speak out. I appreciate that. Frank and I got to be friends in Hartsdale Church in New York City. Thank you very much, Raj. I appreciate your being here today.
Glad to do it.
And you did a great job, as you always do. Thank you all. Goodbye, everybody. Nice to see all of you, some old friends and some new. Love you guys all. Bye-bye.
Bye.